Good day, friends. There is a short story written by Henry, the name of which is After 20 Years. After 20 Years is very interesting short story written by Henry. And the story of this is the story of about two friends, two long lost friends, Jimmy Wells and Bob, our childhood best friend. New York City, though they were like brothers in their youth, they gradually fell out of contact with one another. While Jimmy remained in New York, Bob moved out west to pursue his fortune. Before parting ways, however, the two of them agreed to meet 20 years later at Big Joe's Brady's restaurant, the place where they last saw one another. After 20 years, Bob is waiting for Jimmy at the restaurant when a police officer sees him lurking in a dark doorway. The police officer approached Bob, and Bob reassures him that he is only there to meet an old friend. After learning a bit about Bob's story and his pact with Jimmy, the patrolman moves on. Bob continues to wait for Jimmy long past their agreed upon meeting time, confident that his friend will arrive. Eventually, a man in an overcoat approached Bob and introduced himself as Jimmy. The two old friends embrace and walk arm in arm, telling each other about their lives. Eventually, however, they walked by a drugstore with a bright light. Bob realized that the man is not Jimmy. It is too late. And the man reveals himself to be an undercover police officer. He arrests Silky Bob, and hands him a note from a police officer named Patrolman Wells. The note revealed that the officer from earlier in the story was Jimmy, but he couldn't bring himself to arrest Bob, so he sent his plainclothes police officer instead. So after 20 years, this the story of the Bob and Jimmy. A police officer patrols a street at 10 o'clock. The story begins at night. He walks confidently, but he is clearly not for shows, as there is no one on the street. The policeman twirls his club with skill and dexterity, and he checks on the houses. Most places are closed, however, as the street is mostly comprised of stores and businesses. The policeman shows down as he notices a man in the shadow of the hardware store doorway. The stranger has an unlit cigar in his mouth, and the policeman walks up to him. The man reassures the officer that he was a legitimate reason to be waiting there. He explained that he made an appointment 20 years ago to meet someone at that spot, which used to be called Big Joe's Brady's restaurant. The policeman says that the restaurant was torn down 5 years before. The man lights his cigar, highlighting his pale face, a square jaw, and intelligent eyes, and the white scar. He explained that 20 years ago he dined at Big Joe's Brady's with an old friend, Jimmy Wells, who he had grown up with. They were raised together in New York, but they parted because he wanted to travel west, whereas Jimmy wanted to remain in New York. That night they agreed to meet at the same location 20 years later and catch up with each other's life. The policeman appreciate the story and asked if they have corresponded since. The man explained they did it for a few years, but then eventually they stopped. He assumed some fault for it, explaining that the West was a big and distracting place and he was always hustling about. Despite this, the man claims that Jimmy will meet him here because he is the truest and the most loyal man in the world. The man has traveled over 1,000 miles to get here, but he says if the Jimmy comes, it will have been worth it. The policeman asks whether the man did well out west, and the man says yes, claiming that the West makes you sharp. The policeman wishes him luck and goes on his way. The man smokes on the doorway as he waits for his friends to arrive. He is uncertain whether Jimmy will arrive. After 20 minutes. A tall man shows up. The man asks if it's Bob, and Bob asks if he's Jimmy. They confirm who they are, and Jimmy expresses sadness that the old restaurant is gone. Bob comments on how much Jimmy has grown. Jimmy suggests that they walk to a place he knows to reminisce about when they were young. They walk arm in arm down the street, and Bob egoistically tells Jimmy about his time out west. So what happened? The two men walked under bright lights at the drugstore and looked each other. Bob stops and lets go of Jimmy's arm, telling him that he knows he is not actually Jimmy. Even after 20 years, the tall man comments on how time can turn people bad, and then says that Silky Bob is under arrest. He says that Chicago wired them Bob might be in town. Bob goes with the plainclothes police officer quietly, and a tall man gives him a note from the patrolman Wells. Bob unfolds the note and begins to read that note. His hand is steady at first, but when he started to read it, it begins to tremble his hand. The note is from an old friend, Jimmy Wells, who reveals himself as the policeman from earlier. He says that he was at the restaurant on time, but recognized Bob as the wanted man from Chicago. He explained that he could not get himself to arrest Bob himself, so he sent another police officer to do for him the same. So, friends, this is the story of after 20 years. The theme of this is it is about loyalty and duty. Oh, Henry tells us about time and identity, and this is appearance, character, and morals. This is the story of how time change and how the friends change also, and how they started to trust and distrust each other with the passage of time. Their loyalties and their duty and their all love and their affection with each other changed. So, ladies and gentlemen, I hope you will enjoy this interesting short story after 20 years.